the chair of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies and the Breen Chair in Catholic Theology here at John Carroll University. I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, on behalf of the Breen Chair in Catholic Theology, on behalf of the Mandel Chair in Jewish Studies, on behalf of the Toohey Chair in Interreligious Studies. We're all glad that you are here with us this evening. We have a special guest with us this evening who's going to offer some reflections on the book of Deuteronomy and early Israelite history. And I will introduce the speaker and the respondent, and I hope that their remarks will invite some reflection and some exchange after they make their formal presentations. Our special guest, our main speaker this evening, is Father Dominik Markl, who is a Jesuit priest from Austria, who has been professor of Hebrew Bible, Old Testament at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome since 2013. This fall, he has been serving as a visiting professor and Jesuit chair at Georgetown University. He has taught courses at Heathrow College in London, at Hekima College in Nairobi, at the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley, California, in the Ateneo de Manila University, the Philippines, and the University of Innsbruck at Austria, in his hometown. His research, Father Markl's research, focuses on the Pentateuch, on imperial theologies in the ancient Near East, in the development of monotheism, in cultural trauma, in the Bible as a history of political ideas. He has collaborated in interdisciplinary research on justifications for mass violence. His edited books include The Fall of Jerusalem and the Rise of the Torah, 2016, and The Decalogue and its Cultural Influence in 2013. He contributed the Introduction to the Pentateuch to the Jerome Biblical Commentary for the 21st Century, and the entry on Deuteronomy to the Paulist Biblical Commentary. So we have with us a very accomplished, internationally known scholar of the Hebrew Bible. We also have with us a Jesuit who loves the mountains and loves music. It's a true Austrian. Responding to Father Markl this evening is Dr. Noah Bickert, the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Chair in Jewish Studies right here at John Carroll University. Dr. Bickert studied Talmud at the Pardes Institute in Jerusalem before earning graduate degrees in Hebrew Bible and Rabbinics at Harvard Divinity School and the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. His scholarly interests include the Talmudic academies of late antiquity, particularly how these schools compared to nearby Syriac Christian schools that were operating at the same time. His new book, I have just seen the first copies of his new book, which arrived today from Georgia Press, is The Scholastic Culture of the Babylonian Talmud. Dr. Bickert also likes music, having once worked as a recording engineer for Blue Note Records in New York. And he also likes mountains, particularly riding his bike up mountains. So we've invited Father Markl to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, after which Dr. Bickert will offer a brief response, and then we'll open it up to discussion between the two of them and with all of you. So please join me in welcoming Father Dominik Markl to present Choose Life So That You May Live, the Moab Covenant and the Rise of Monotheism.
Thank you very much indeed at Hannenberg for the kind introduction and the organization of this event. Together with him, I would like to thank Doris Donnelly, who has been an extremely generous host. I think it's not a secret that it was her original idea, but in collaboration with at Hannenberg. I would like to thank already now Dr. Bickert for his willingness to respond. And I would like to say that it's an extreme honor, and I feel even humbled that two very renowned rabbis attend this meeting, and a scholar in Islam as well, coming from Austria with its difficult history and the National Socialist past. It is beautiful to experience interreligious dialogue in this really warm-hearted, open atmosphere that I have already experienced after a few minutes. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great joy for me to speak about Deuteronomy. It's my first love in scholarship. It's my passion. It's been my favorite book for many years, and I don't doubt that I will enjoy researching and writing about it for many years more, because it's inexhaustible, like every sacred text of the Hebrew Bible, but it is exceptional in many ways in its depth of reflection and complexity. I hope that the material that you have, the handouts, and thank you again for preparing that, will help not losing orientation, because I fear I was a bit ambitious in trying to cover quite a lot of ground. The first page that you have is basically the structure of what I would like to present in 5 points. Then the second page that you have is a structure or an attempt at presenting the structure and contents of Deuteronomy. And then you have the 2 texts we will be concentrating on from Deuteronomy 4 and Deuteronomy 29 to 30. So let's start with the first point. The literary context of Deuteronomy. So in order to imagine ourselves into the world of the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, and the historiography of Israel from creation to the destruction of Jerusalem, from Genesis, the first chapter of Genesis, to the last chapter of the books of Kings, let's just remember the main storyline from Exodus to Deuteronomy in the 5 books of Moses. That's the geographical setting for it. In Exodus, the people of Israel find themselves in Egypt. The first half of the book, chapters 1 to 18, describe the liberation from Egypt. They arrive at Mount Sinai, where the people will be staying from the Sinai theophany in Exodus 19 to Numbers 11, so the center of the Torah, of the Pentateuch, is staged at Sinai. In the book of Numbers, chapters 11 to 36, they move on the 40 years, the famous 40 years, through the wilderness until they arrive in the land of Moab, beyond the Jordan, with a view of the promised land, but not yet really in there. And this is where Deuteronomy is staged. The entire book of Deuteronomy is staged in the plains of Moab. The book of Joshua tells us how the people of Israel take the promised land into possession, and there the books of Judges, Samuel, and Kings are staged, and this is where the catastrophes hit in. In 2 Kings 17, we are told the history of the downfall of the northern kingdom. Around 720 BCE, the Assyrian Empire conquers this territory, and in 2 Kings 25, the same fate befalls Jerusalem at the hand of the Babylonians. The Babylonian army besieges the city twice, in 597 and in 587 BCE, and in 587 BCE, large parts of the populations are deported to Babylonia, and the city is destroyed, including the temple and the palace. this is the ultimate catastrophe, and that's the end of this enormous historiography of Israel from creation to the destruction of Jerusalem. And that's one of the astonishing aspects of this history, that it ends in total disaster. Why do people write such an incredible, unique historiography and antiquity for it to end in disaster? So within these books, Deuteronomy is found at the center, at the end of the Pentateuch, at the beginning of what scholars have called the Deuteronomistic historiography, from Deuteronomy to Kings. Why? Because Joshua to Kings has several ideological elements, aspects that are found and theologically deeply rooted in Deuteronomy. It's a scholarly construct. And at the same time, at the center of this huge historiography. Now, Deuteronomy is important at this center because Moses, who gives his final farewell speeches on the last day of his life in this book, speaks as a prophet. He speaks about the future. He predicts that in case Israel will not be obedient to the divine laws that he teaches, they will eventually lose the land that they are now in Moab supposed to take into possession. They will lose it. And this is what actually happens in 2 Kings. The issue of the so-called Babylonian exile. There is also an Assyrian exile in the first downfall of the northern kingdom, and then the Babylonian exile in the 6th century. The grand prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, that follow in our standard editions of the Bibles, that is in the Jewish order of the books, they engage deeply with the issue of these catastrophes. Deuteronomy, at the center of this complex, of this huge literary complex, is quite unique in nature because it is a sequence of speeches, of discourses of Moses, where Moses reflects deeply on the history as Israel has experienced it in the Exodus, at Horeb. Horeb is Deuteronomy's name for Mount Sinai, with the grand theophany, with the Horeb covenant. At the same time, Moses speaks as a prophet about the future. He commands the people to take the land into possession, but he also predicts that it might be lost. And as the historiography shows, it turns out that his prophecy was all too correct. So, not by coincidence, the voice of Moses and Deuteronomy employs the word today very often. It's today that Moses is speaking about the past and about the future. And this today is extremely significant because it's one of the words that carries the voice of Moses into the present of future readers, even into our present today. We will see how sublimely this works in this book later. Deuteronomy, therefore, is a book at borders. It's staged at the border of the Promised Land, symbolically the River Jordan. Even the first verse of the book mentions this. Ele hadevarim asher diber Moshe ve'ever hayarden. These are the words that Moses spoke to Israel beyond the Jordan. It's a symbolic border, threshold, and the border of Moses' life. Moses has to deliver his farewell speeches. He has to teach the Torah now because he knows he cannot enter the land. He knows he has to die before Israel is about to enter the land. And therefore, he has to transmit his wisdom about divine revelation before his death. While Israel has to transcend the border of the land, Moses has to transcend the border of death. And this is the perspective from which the book is told. It's the view from Mount Nebo, where that is now in modern Jordan, high above the Dead Sea, with the view of the Promised Land. In the background, we would see Jerusalem on the hills. It is the last view that Moses receives from God himself before his death. It's the Promised Land that Moses receives as a visual gift, but he's not allowed to enter it. And with this land in view, Moses dies upon the mouth of God, as the Hebrew text literally says. So this is the major setting of the book of Deuteronomy. Just to give you an impression of its overall contents, I gave you this overview of the structure. It is a collection of major discourses that are highly complex in looking back to history, in predicting the future, but at its center is this Torah discourse. Torah means teaching, wisdom, also legal teaching, and it is basically a novel account, a reform in some ways of the laws that God revealed at Mount Sinai. This is the very core of Deuteronomy, chapters 12 to 26. But the Torah discourse, the entire discourse, stretches from chapters 5 to 26, and it is introduced by a reaccount of the Horeb covenant and the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue. But we will be concentrating on two texts that frame the central Torah discourse, namely the introductory speech, chapters 1 to 4, the fourth chapter, which is the immediate preparation for the central Torah discourse, and the Moab covenant discourse, chapters 29 to 30, which is the solemn conclusion of the major speeches of Moses in this book. They are preceded by another very important text, and an extreme text, the blessings and curses of chapter 28. The curses are never read in church because they are just too tough. We Catholics usually don't dare to read text like that in liturgy. I think in the synagogue, everything is read from the Torah, so courageous liturgy. Chapters 32 and 33, the Song of Moses and the blessings of Moses, are very exceptional poetry, completely different style from all the rest of the book. But just to give an orientation where our text will be placed at the end of the introductory discourse and the solemn conclusion, they have a special weight for the theology of the book. With that general introduction to the literary context and structure of the book, let's move on to the historical context. This is what historical critical investigation of the Pentateuch has yielded over the past 2 centuries, scholars generally believe now that while the Pentateuch is staged in the late 2nd millennium BCE, that is around 1200 BCE, it was basically compiled significantly later. When exactly, in what stages exactly, is enormously disputed among scholars, but for Deuteronomy, the 7th century and the 6th century BCE, precisely the context of the major catastrophes and the imperial aggression of the Assyrians and the Babylonians are settings that are highly relevant for our texts. Therefore, I will mention a few aspects of these empires. This is a map of the Assyrian Empire from the 8th and then in the 7th centuries BCE. The Assyrians managed to create an empire that is huge even in modern standards. It comprised what is now Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Egypt, parts of Turkey, a huge imperial space, the first empire in history in a strict sense because it was highly organized. And the northern kingdom of Israel fell victim to it, was destroyed. Judah was not destroyed, but was politically dependent and had to pay tribute. The Assyrians were extremely aggressive, militaristic, and they did not hesitate to show their power, strength, and violence in their propaganda in the palaces in Nineveh and other. These are the famous Lachish reliefs now at the British Museum from Nineveh, southeast of Jerusalem, around 700 BCE, where the Assyrians destroyed many cities in the surroundings of Jerusalem, in the area of Judah. We see archers here. The city is trying to defend itself. At the same time, we see already how women and children leave the city gate and go into exile, that is, to Assyria. They are deported with a few belongings that they can take with them, while soldiers are being killed brutally, slayed. So military aggression was very much part and a terrible part of the experience of Judahites in this period. An extremely important text for our historical research into the Bible was discovered in the 1950s in the Nabu temple of Nimrud. It dates to 672 BCE. It's the succession treaties of Esarhaddon, the Assyrian imperial king, who, in a textual mass production that probably was unprecedented, had this text sent into all provinces of this huge empire, and officials were forced to swear an oath of loyalty to the Assyrian king and his designated crown prince, Ashurbanipal. In addition to the copies that were found in the 1950s, in 2009, another copy of this same text was discovered in Tel Tainat, which is northern Syria, the ancient landscape. The ancient Kunulua, which shows us that it was really distributed in all these countries, and we can be quite certain that it even was exposed in the Temple of Jerusalem. That is, historians see that as more than likely. This is a tablet found in Tel Tainat, and it was discovered in the sanctuary, in a Syrian-built sanctuary. So religion and politics went very closely together in the ancient Near East, and after the Middle Ages, it was the gods who protected this loyalty oath. The god Ashur, the main god of the Assyrian Empire. The text is composed around this oath, where all subjects, basically, of the empire have to swear in the first person plural, we will be loyal to the designated crown prince. And this oath is protected by a long series of curses before and after it, and then surrounded by invocations of the deities. Now, why is this text so important for our study of the Bible? Because we find quite striking similarities in formulations between these texts and texts that we find in the book of Deuteronomy. One example is the so-called canon formula. You must not take away or add anything from these words. The issue of high treason that we find in Deuteronomy 13 and paragraph 10 of Esarhaddon's succession treaty, and some of the curses that are remarkably similar. So here is another example, the transmission of the obligation to children and grandchildren that we also find in Deuteronomy 6, where it's about teaching these statutes, the divine laws, to children and grandchildren, is also found here. And a text that will be very interesting for us at the end of chapter 29, in the Moab covenant. The secret things belong to Adonai our God, but the revealed things belong to us and to our children forever, to observe all the words of this Torah. The covenant that is made in the book of Deuteronomy is about loyalty to God, the God of Israel, and his Torah, his teachings. That is not the Assyrian imperial king. Deuteronomy never speaks directly about Assyria, but it has the Assyrian brutal propaganda in mind and writes against it sublimely. And the message is very clear. Our loyalty is not to the Assyrian Empire, but to our God. So this is why the Assyrian propaganda is very important for our texts. This is more or less the extent of the Babylonian Empire that followed, which is smaller but was destructive to Jerusalem. And that meant it was the ultimate catastrophe for the biblical people of Israel and Judah, who suffered the loss of their political independence, but more than that, the structure of the temple, the religious identity connected to this most sacred place, and the land. Many fled to Egypt, many were deported to Babylonia. It was only under the Assyrians that King Cyrus the Great allowed people who had been deported to Babylonia to return to their original home countries. This is the Cyrus Cylinder, where this policy is announced around 539 BCE, when Cyrus conquered the city of Babylon. This policy was initiated, and return and restoration against the background of this imperial background will also play a role, as we will see in the book of Deuteronomy. So the Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian empires are very important contexts for the redaction of, and probably in several steps, redaction of the book of Deuteronomy. these catastrophes are addressed in the voice of Moses, the grand teacher from of old. This is a literary technique found in many texts in antiquity, that the grand teachers, prophets, kings from of old are used as voices to address a later period. And this is, of course, a very sophisticated, very thoughtful way of speaking to another time, a new present. So let's now, with these two backgrounds, the literary contexts and the historical contexts, move into our texts. Both will be important in order to understand the first text I would like to look at together with you, the Moab Covenant Discourse, chapters 29 to 30, which is an especially complicated but fascinating text. It is printed, the text is printed on the handout. I hope some of you have had the chance to read it beforehand. Parts of it will be known even from Catholic liturgy. Chapter 30 is very well known for its beautiful theological passages. But in order to understand this text in its entirety, we should look into what it is about. And this, we are told in the heading, in the superscript of the text, Ele divrei haberit asher tziva Adonai. Et Moshe, these are the words of the covenant that Adonai commanded Moses to make with the Israelites in the land of Moab, in addition to the covenant that he had made with them at Horeb. So, it is a different covenant from the Sinai covenant. It is another covenant. And how does the Horeb Sinai covenant work in the book of Exodus? Just very briefly, in Exodus 19 to 24, it is like a major constitutional process in negotiations between God and the people, mediated by Moses. God offers the covenant in chapter 19. The people express their consent. So God reveals the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue, as the first major legal text. The people request mediation through Moses. They cannot hear this voice any longer. God reveals to Moses the book of the covenant, which Moses transmits to the people. They again express their consent twice, and thus in a major dialogue between God and people, the constitution of the covenant is made and ratified. There is a lot of, if you wish, democracy in nucleo in this conception, because the consent of the people, all the people, is essential for this process. Our text in Deuteronomy 29 to 30 is very different. And we should notice that it is a monologue. It's Moses' discourse, and there is no response by the people. Why is that? And it is strange for a covenant text. It starts quite understandably. First, Moses starts with what in other treaty texts in the ancient Near East is common, to start with some history. You have seen with your own eyes what God has done for you. In these years in the wilderness, you have been protected, and so on. So the good relationship that exists between the partners of the covenant, the historical prologue, that is very clear and common. What follows is also quite usual for a covenant text. All the people are present to enter the covenant. That's a basic legal requirement for a treaty. The parties need to be present to enter the treaty. But then Moses seems to go off the rail in a major digression to the future. It's still legally understandable what happens in case of a false oath, in case you swear falsely in this legal process. There will be major consequences. But Moses takes time to expand on that. And he says that the consequences will be dire. This entire land will be destroyed. Moses quotes figures, voices from the future who will ask, why has God done all this to this country? And another voice will respond, because they have broken the covenant. And I have quoted it here. Therefore, Adonai uprooted them from their land in anger, fury, and great wrath, and cast them into another land, as it is today. So this is not a mistake. Moses is quoting a voice in the future. But this voice uses the word today, which is meant to pierce the hearts of those who truly are in exile. But that's not the end of the discourse. That's a dramatic climax. But then Moses goes on to say, and here we are moving into chapter 30, and it will be when all these things have come upon you, the blessing and the curse. That's when fate will turn. You will return to God. You will take it to heart. You will experience conversion. You will return to God. And God will bring you back to the promised land. And fortune will come again. First 10 verses. So this is what actually happened in the Persian period, the only moment in the history of Israel when these imperial deportations were officially undone and reversed to return and restoration. Then Moses goes on with the idea, this word is very near to you, in your mouth and in your heart. And the end of the discourse is again very powerful. I have laid before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life so that you may live. It depends on you. Now, this is again understandable. Moses urges his audience, the people of Israel in the land of Moab, to make a decision. A choice between life and death. And life means consent to the covenant, entering the covenant, saying, yes, we will be obedient to the Torah, we will be faithful to God. But this response that we would expect is never given by the people. In the book of Deuteronomy, at least, we are not told that this response is given. So here's a major question. Why is this information missing? And in order to try to understand this, we should look more closely into these verses of chapter 30. And here happens, I think, one of the most ingenious literary tricks of the Hebrew Bible. Here, Moses extends a simple word, you, to an incredible time span in saying, when all these things will happen to you, the blessings and the curses that I set before you, if you call them to mind among all the nations where Adonai your God has driven you. So, who is you? Generally speaking, you in Deuteronomy is the people of Israel in Moab. But here the you suddenly extends some 6 centuries beyond this moment. when all these things will happen to you, the blessings and the curses. The curse means when you will have lost the land because of disobedience. And this happens in its full extent only in 587 BCE, centuries after the moment Moses is speaking in the world of the text. The you reaches centuries beyond the time of Moses, and this is easily possible because he is the greatest of all prophets. If you call into mind among the nations where Adonai your God has driven you, you will return to Adonai your God, and you and your children obey him concerning everything that I am commanding you today. And here we find Moses' you switching between time periods, the future and the present in Moab. And this technique of the switching and ambiguous you is continued in what follows. What I am commanding you today, that is here in Moab, but you, Israel, in the future, maybe many generations down the road of history, all of them are included in this simple word, you. There is another complication. I'll try to put it simply. Who are your ancestors in Deuteronomy 35? So unfortunately, I fear we don't have the verse numbers in the translation, but this is in Deuteronomy 30. Even if you're exiled to the ends of the world, from there the Lord will gather you, and from there will bring you back. The Lord your God will bring you into the land, and so on. Moreover, he will make you more prosperous and numerous than your ancestors. Who are the ancestors? So, to cut a long story short, the ancestors, in my interpretation at least, in this passage are the people Moses is now addressing in Moab, because they are supposed to take the land into possession. But the voice of Moses is also speaking to the future generation in exile, whose ancestors have taken the land into possession. So, strictly speaking, there is something not quite functioning well for Moses' addresses in Deuteronomy, in Moab, but it works perfectly well for people in exile. I will spare you the details because they are a little bit complicated. Theologically, this passage is extremely beautiful because it plays on a Hebrew verb. The translation cannot bring that out in all its beauty. The verb is shuv, which in one stem can mean to return, and in another stem it means to bring back in Hifil. So, and the same verb is used for both Israel and God. The blue occurrences are for Israel, the red occurrences for God. It's the same verb. When you will bring it back to your heart, you take it to heart. You will return to Adonai your God, and Adonai your God will restore your fortunes. He will return and gather you. So it's a mutual process of returning, bringing back, conversion and restoration, expressed with the same verb, used exactly 7 times. I need to be a little bit careful with time. Circumcision of the heart, very important motif in the center of this passage. The word is very near to you. And the final call, choose life so that you may live. Make a choice. Enter the covenant. I think the clue, the trick of this chapter is that this you continues to address future Israel in exile. That is, we are not told the response of Israel in the world of the text, because the commitment, the yes, we will, is expected from the audience of the book, if you will, from us as we read the book today. Choose life so that you may live. It's an extremely beautiful formulation for that final call, and what follows is another complexity. I will put it very briefly. For ki hu chayecha, and now the difficulty arises. Some translations say, for he is thy life, as the King James Version has it, and the Vulgate. Or for that means life to you, that is obeying God, as the New Revised Standard Version has it, and the Septuagint has it. It's very difficult to determine. I, again, will spare you the details, but the point is, I think, that both is true. It's God himself who is your life, and it's his Torah, and keeping his Torah, that is your life. So, in a single word, very small word, with a little ambiguity, a whole theology is hidden at the end of this chapter. At its center, we find this enigmatic verse. The secret things belong to Adonai our God, but the revealed things belong to us and to our children forever, to observe all the words of this Torah. This is, as it were, the voice that resounds from what readers, we as audience, are supposed to commit ourselves to. I have 5 minutes left, so let's try to have a brief look at this fascinating chapter 4. The beginning of the introductory discourse, where a quite similar message is found in verses 23 to 31, where this digression to the future that Moses presents in chapters 29 to 30 is presented shorter, more succinctly, and more homogeneously. Therefore, I would argue it depends on the longer version. It brings it together more succinctly. It is written maybe a bit later. A central motif in it is the same. In exile, when you're gone when you're among other nations, you will return to God. The motif of conversion. So again, the prophecy of exile, which is followed by a unique text in the Pentateuch, because it's one of the few texts in the entire Hebrew Bible that explicitly claim that no other God exists. Now, for us, this may seem to be taken for granted, because over centuries and millennia, we have become used to the fact that we believe in only one God. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But for people in antiquity, that was the most strange thing you could ever think of. Because everybody knew that there are thousands of gods. Everybody knew that. Everybody knew that in Ashur, in Greece, in Egypt, in Rome, there were so many gods. And of course, they have their gods, we have our gods. That's okay. Many gods are translatable. Jupiter is Zeus. That's fine. And some strange Jews invent the idea that the other gods are nothings. There is only one God, which they claim is theirs. That was really completely unheard of. So it's a major question for the history of religion, how on earth anybody could have that idea in antiquity. And this is one of the few texts that really makes this claim. The Decalogue says, the Ten Commandments, not will there be any other God for you, lecha, against my face. Of course they exist. Other people venerate them. But you will not bow down for them. You will not pray to them. That implies they are there. Not for you. But this text says he is the God, there is no other besides him. And this is a very, very rare formulation that we find as well in the so-called Deutero-Isaiah, Isaiah 45, where the divine voice, where the God of Israel is speaking to King Cyrus, the Persian King Cyrus, who is called the anointed, the Mashiach, the Messiah of God. God has called this Persian king to rescue Israel, Jacob, to make it known to the ends of the world that I am God, there is no other. This same idea is found in Deuteronomy 4, where the prophecy of exile and conversion in exile precedes this discovery, this theological discovery. There is no other. Now, of course, I would have to flesh out this argument much more to make it perhaps a little bit more credible for you, but the overall conclusion and what I would like to say in the end about these wonderful, deep theological texts in Deuteronomy and the Hebrew Bible, I believe they show that against the background of extremely difficult, even traumatic experience of military defeat, complete military defeat, deportation, forced migration, exile, the Judean theologians who are the masterminds behind these words of Moses were able to develop profundity, deep thought. They, upon reflection, understood exile, deep suffering, as a period of conversion, return to God, and even as a period of a deep theological discovery of the only God. I believe Judaism and Christianity and Islam owe, historically speaking, this discovery to those Judean theologians of the, I guess, second half of the 6th century BCE. What I think we can take home is that the most difficult times, the most dramatic times in history may be times that open up opportunities for deep reflection, profundity, and return. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Should I clip this now? Hi, everyone. I'm also very honored to be here. I guess it's my home institution. I don't know if you say this. Among the things that I think ties rabbinic Jews and Catholics together, and something I've really only discovered in my relatively recent time here, is the way in which the critical historical exploration of the Hebrew Bible is not seen as somehow antithetical to a sort of modern lived faith tradition, but in many ways has been integrated into it. I think, speaking personally, since I am a scholar of the Babylonian Talmud, which is mostly defined by its debate and its multivocality and plurality of voices, is what happens when you study the Bible, according to the method you've seen tonight, is you actually end up seeing that there are multiple voices within the corpus as a whole, and even in, say, a book like Deuteronomy. And in some ways, I'll say it from my perspective, it makes the text a more Jewish text, right? Because you have multi-vocality, variety of different voices at play, and I think some of the ways in which contemporary religious people can integrate this kind of method of study is by reflecting on the fact that maybe the Bible isn't a single voice speaking to us, right? But that the truth is actually very, very, very complicated, and that when you sort of are able to draw out these variety of different voices, you can really see how complicated all of this is. And so I think this is modeled, in some sense, exactly how engagement with historical critical questions, when did this idea arrive, and why did it come, actually can provide a great deal of information to people of contemporary faith who are looking to the Bible for questions like, how do I respond to trauma? What is my community supposed to do in response to terrible situations? So I'm not going to do a point-by-point sort of response, but I'd like to respond in some general ways, and I hope that will add to a little bit of conversation. First of all, in terms of the sort of broad framing, I think the question of situating Deuteronomy in the corpus and broadly asking the question of how can it be that the Hebrew Bible ends with such tragedy? Well, the Jewish response in many ways is to argue that the Pentateuch, the Torah, has primacy. And that maybe in the corpus as a whole ends in tragedy, but if you separate the Pentateuch from the rest of the Deuteronomic histories, it actually reads quite differently. And in fact, in the Jewish lectionary cycle, we just ended the book of Deuteronomy, and in some sense, beginnings and endings is not the question. The Torah is not read linearly, it's read cyclically. So that, of course, at the very end of Deuteronomy, when this great promise, this great question, will the people say yes, or will the people say no? Will they cross the Jordan and live in this sort of utopian society or not? Right? That question is left hanging, and you don't get to hear the answer. You don't continue into Joshua. You go back to the beginning of Genesis, right? And that cyclical way of reading the book may have a slightly different kind of approach. Jews, too, are concerned about the curses. There's so many ways in which Jews and Catholics have very similar responses. So it's wonderful to know that Catholics don't read the curses in church. Jews do read the curses, but there's this very long-standing tradition of reading them in an undertone. So of course you have to read the whole Pentateuch, but it's read so quietly that nobody actually gets to hear them. So they're read, but they're not heard. And in fact, it's usually the custom in most Jewish congregations that the rabbi be honored with that lectionary cycle, because you couldn't give it to anybody else, right? What a terrible, it's not an honor. It'd be a curse to be up there where the curses be read. So give it to the rabbi, right? The rabbi can handle it in that kind of sense. The other thing is of course, that these chapters, especially chapters 29 and 30, are incredibly central to later Jewish theologies. There are no coincidences in scholarship. I was teaching a passage this afternoon from Maimonides, the great medieval Jewish sage, about Maimonides' view of Christianity, which is a topic for another time. It's not so nice, the kinds of things that he has to say. But of course, Maimonides makes clear, and really drawing on the Talmudic tradition there, that this question in Deuteronomy 30 of the people at some point will be exiled, and they will come back. There will be this distancing from God and return, which of course from a historical critical perspective, we are supposed to read, as you've heard tonight, and I think this is 100% true, is talking about the Babylonian exile. Of course, Talmudic Judaism and Maimonides and later Judaism doesn't read it in terms of the first exile, but reads it in terms of the second exile, what Jews would call our present exile. That is to say, this question of distance from God and then return to God is not only a sort of historical question in the past, but it is read as very present. And so this question of Hayom, today, what will the answer be? In many ways, later Judaisms read these texts not about avotecha, right, your ancestors, but yourselves. The you of this question is carried not only forward to the generation of the Babylonian exile, but to contemporary readers of the text, and that is done very intentionally. I'm curious, however, about this notion of, as we've heard translated, today. In Hebrew, it's not exactly hayom, but it's ke hayom. Now, exactly how one translates that prefix ke, it's sort of a relative prefix, probably best translated like today, as if it were today. And so I wonder the degree to which we can distinguish between what is intended to be Moses's sort of fictitious audience at the context of the Moabite covenant, and how much this today is meant to be heard as the time period of the actual audience of the book in terms of the time of its actual creation. This like may confuse it at some point. And I wonder if there is a little bit more elision between time periods. This may be happening sort of on purpose, that it's much less clear when the today is that's being spoken of. And I wonder if a similar sort of question could be asked about the you. Again, it reads very separately in English, where we have you as a separate word. Of course, in biblical Hebrew, this you is not a separate word, but a suffix. And to what degree is this suffix attached with ease to verbs and nouns in this passage? Is it possible that there's a sort of elision taking place, not as separate yous, the you here and the you there and the you in the future, but a sort of more general you? And I guess I'm sort of wondering about how ancient people would not have understood our contemporary insistence on the individual. Right? In many ways, this solves a lot of biblical problems, perhaps most famously raised in Job, right? Anytime you teach Job, it's very nice that Job has it's not nice that he has all his kids killed, right? He gets new kids at the end, and that's supposed to make us feel better. From a modern perspective, we say, I don't understand, these were individuals, those were people. The fact that you got more kids at the end doesn't make up for the fact that those people really existed. Seemingly, in the biblical mind, there is much less of a sense of the individual, that one person is fungible for another, in certain kinds of ways. And so I wonder if this you, which we might profitably interpret as the you now in the Moab context, and the you in the future, is it possible that you just seems to mean Israel, right? Which is a corporate identity which transcends individual generations and is meant to stand for much larger periods of time. A couple of other pieces. I'm really intrigued to see this deep question as to in Deuteronomy 30, 19, or 20. The verse numbers don't always exactly match up. But this notion of ki hu chayecha, before it or he is your life. What is this talking about? Already in the 11th century, Ibn Ezra, the great Spanish sage, responds precisely to this problem. Ki hu chayecha, he says, al dat ha'mefarshim, according to the commentators, shehu shav el kol Hashem, that the it refers to the returning to God, that your life is this process of return. So he acknowledges this is one way to read it. I guess that's the Septuagint's version. He says, Ulefi dati, but my opinion, shehu Hashem, that it's God is your life. Not the returning to God, but that God's self is your life. And so in many ways, this shows that the that the medieval Jewish commentators already are able to intuit many of the interpretive issues that we see in this text. If there's one point at which I might disagree, it is on this question of Deuteronomy 4 being the original statement of monotheism. And I think this distinction between what we might call monolatry, right, the insistence that one worship only one God, and monotheism, the notion that there is only one God, is certainly one that's worth exploring. I guess I'm a little bit skeptical of the notion that even here in Deuteronomy 4 there is this shift to the kind of monotheism that we might think of today, and I say this as a monotheist, right? So I recognize how sort of strange it might be to hear this. But I guess that one thing I'd like people to think about is, what is it, right? What is idolatry, in a sense? Is idolatry a mistaken idea? Is it about the ontology of gods? Or is it about their worship? And I think among the core features of Deuteronomy is really that the Israelite experience of God is not one of belief, right? There really isn't a good word for belief in that sense in biblical Hebrew. When Deuteronomy commands, or Moses in Deuteronomy commands the Israelites to love God, this is not an emotional response, an individual emotive response between an individual and God, but it really is a sense of displaying one's fidelity through action to God. And so that I wonder if really what is being asserted is there is no other God, right, means that we cannot worship any other God. And that I wonder how much there is a distinction here. And I've been encouraged to quote from even earlier Akkadian texts, right? That in the that there are older texts which seem to utilize this phrase of "there is no other," right? Which doesn't mean that there is no other in an ontological sense, but really that there is no one that I can interact with. There's a famous prayer by Rabbi Akiva in the Talmud. Rabbi Akiva, there's a terrible rain or lack of rain, and Rabbi Akiva is encouraged to give a prayer, and he gets up there and he says, "Avinu Malkeinu, ein lanu melech ela ata." Oh, our Father, our King, we have no king besides you. Well, does that mean that there is no other king? Can Rabbi Akiva not conceive of other kings? What does it mean that we have no, and you can even hear that ein, right? In some ways it's drawing on the same kind of linguistic sense. Is there really no other king? No, it's that we don't interact with another king. We can't behave in relationship to another king. And so I want us to at least be careful as to whether or not the sort of idolatry is one of thought, as one of conceiving of something, as opposed to one of behaving. And I guess there's one final question I'd love to ask, which is, in as much as the relationship between Deuteronomy 29 and 30 is clear to Deuteronomy 4, there's of course another powerful passage in Deuteronomy that I think is recalled by Deuteronomy 29 and 30, and that of course is Deuteronomy 6, 4-9, what Jews think of as the Shema, right? Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Listen, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord. Now, how you translate it here is going to be complicated. The Lord alone, the Lord uniquely towards you. God is one. How we translate this, of course, is going to affect our theologies in powerful ways. But that text goes on to say, "V'hayu hadvarim ha'ela asher anochi mitzavacha hayom." These words which I command you, right, shall be al levavecha. They should be in your heart. Now, of course, in ancient Israel, heart doesn't mean the seat of the emotions, but it means the seat of the intellect. One memorizes things in one's heart. And so that text about sort of knowing the context, knowing the content of the law, it's in you. It has been memorized by you. You have repeated it to yourself again and again and again. It seems that that process of internalizing the concepts there is what makes it not far away, what makes it not across the sea, what makes it not in heaven. It's right there in your mouth and in your heart, as it says. And so I wonder if the resonance there to Deuteronomy 6 is at least as powerful as the resonance to Deuteronomy 4. Having quoted this line about the Torah is not in the heavens, right? The instruction is not in the heavens. Of course, this is maybe the grand statement of all of Talmudic Judaism. The Talmud in Tractate Bava Metzia represents or presents a debate, famous debate between Rabbi Eliezer and the sages about the ontology of a particular oven. It's not particularly important what they're fighting about. But of course, Rabbi Eliezer, who refuses to accept the will of the majority, right, insisting that his way is the right way, he's able to perform a number of miracles in order that it is determined that God agrees with him, so much so that he's even able to summon a divine voice which comes down and says, he's right, right? And Rabbi Natan stands up and, quoting this very verse, says, Lo bashamayim hi, the Torah is not in heaven, right? It's no longer up to God to decide debates among humanities. It's up to human beings to decide them. And therefore, regardless of whether God agrees with Rabbi Eliezer or God agrees with the sages, we go according to the sages because the Torah is no longer in heaven, but is now down on earth. And I wonder how much that theology really is implicit in the choice here. So we've seen a number of fascinating analyses of this text. I think it's incredibly powerful text, and so thank you for giving me the opportunity to respond.
Thank you all for coming this evening. Thank you to Father Markl and Dr. Bickert for a wonderful set of reflections on this really beautiful text. So thank you all.